Next, I'm going to talk about the stitch length and the stitch width. So for stitch length, this is basically how far apart each of the stitches is. And this stitch length is regulated on the sewing machine with a knob and has nothing to do with how fast or slow you sew or how fast or slow you push or pull the fabric through. You should never push or pull the fabric through the machine when it's sewing, but allow the machine's feed dogs to bring the fabric through evenly. So on this machine, the stitch length is changed by this button here. Right now, I'm gonna put the stitch length on the very smallest setting, which is on this machine is 0.2. And when you sew with it on 0.2, you can see, or you're going to see, that the stitches are tiny. It is barely moving through here. It's almost too small because sometimes it can get stuck. Now, when we move this up to 5.0, which is the largest stitch length, you'll see the opposite. It's going to move through really quickly, and there's going to be a lot of space in between each of the stitches, okay? Now, this is typically used for basting when you're sewing something that maybe you don't want the stitches to be there forever. Maybe you're sewing where there's going to be a zipper and you're going to rip out the stitching to reveal the zipper, or you're trying out some sizing and you're not really sure which is going to fit, so you want to sew it, try it on, and maybe be able to adjust it. That's when basting comes in really handy. So that's the largest on the stitch length. All right, typically the stitch length that you would want to use just for regular sewing is indicated on the sewing machine. On mine, it's 2.5, and I believe these are millimeters. So we're going to put it back at 2.5 and see how it circled it. You can also tell when you turn off your sewing machine and then turn it back on, the 2.5 is the default setting for the stitch length. Okay, so now we will, well, and I'll show you what the 2.5 is like. That was what we were doing with the sewing maze in previous videos. Okay, I'm gonna just turn the corner so I have some more fabric in front of me, and I'm gonna explain stitch width. Now, stitch width doesn't even come into play when you're on a straight stitch, but it does come into play when you're on a zigzag. So I'm going to lift my needle so that I can change my stitch to stitch 4, which is a zigzag. So this number stays at 0 and this one goes up to 4. I'm going to put my needle back in the fabric and sew. And you can see that the needle's going back and forth doing a zigzag stitch. Now, how far it zigs and how far it zags is stitch width. That is controlled with this knob here. The default is 3.5, but when we move it up to the highest on here, which is 7.0, you're gonna see the needle go further to the right and further to the left. So it's making a giant zigzag. Then, I'll turn the corner. Well, you can see here, small zigzag turned into giant zigzag. And then I'm gonna bring this down to about 1.0 and show you a nice, tiny little zigzag. If I swing this way, you can see what we just sewed. And it's this nice tiny little zigzag. So that's the difference between stitch length and stitch width. And one of the reasons that you would use a zigzag stitch in sewing, I get this question a lot. Obviously you can use it for decorative purposes because it's kind of a cool looking stitch. But for function, it's typically used with stretchy fabrics because it allows the fabric to stretch out a bit more than it would on a straight stitch. Okay, so that's stitch length, stitch width.